Some cases are disturbing because of what we know, but the ones that stay with you are defined by what is missing. Because there is nothing more unsettling than an event where something clearly happened. Yet no one can explain how, when, or why it unfolded the way it did. Across different regions of Africa, there are investigations that never reached a conclusion. Not because they lacked attention, but because every attempt to understand them only revealed more inconsistencies, more contradictions, and more gaps that could not be filled, even after years of analysis. These are not just unsolved cases. They are cases where the logic itself begins to break down, where the available evidence refuses to form a coherent sequence, and where each new detail seems to move the truth further away instead of bringing it closer. What makes them particularly disturbing is the way they begin, because in almost every instance, there is nothing unusual at first. No immediate danger, no clear warning. Just ordinary situations that slowly transition into something that no longer follows predictable patterns. Some involve individuals who disappeared in environments where they should have been traceable, while others revolve around events that were partially witnessed, yet never fully explained, leaving behind fragments that suggest multiple versions of reality without confirming any of them. In certain cases, physical evidence exists but contradicts itself, pointing in directions that cannot coexist within the same timeline. While in others, the complete absence of evidence forces investigators into speculation, where every theory remains possible and none can be proven. As these cases unfold, a pattern begins to emerge, not in what happened, but in how information behaves, appearing just enough to suggest an explanation, but never enough to confirm it, keeping each case suspended between possibility and certainty. And in places where infrastructure, communication, and documentation are not always consistent, these gaps become even more difficult to close. Because once a piece of information is lost, it is often gone permanently, leaving entire segments of the event beyond recovery. The stories you are about to hear are not simply unresolved. They are incomplete in a way that prevents closure, forcing investigators, families, and observers to confront a reality where answers may never fully exist. And as each case reveals only fragments of what might have happened, the question becomes more unsettling with every step. Not just what happened, but whether the full truth was ever within reach to begin with. In 2004, a South African university student named Sibusiso Mthemba left his campus residence in Pretoria after telling friends he needed some time alone. Something that did not immediately raise concern, as it was not unusual for students to step away briefly without informing others of every detail of their movements. He did not take much with him, only essential items, and there was no indication that he intended to travel far or be gone for an extended period, which made the early stage of his absence feel temporary rather than alarming, especially in an environment where independence and routine unpredictability were part of daily life. However, what began as a normal absence slowly shifted into something more difficult to explain, as hours turned into a full day without any communication, and attempts to reach him failed without clear reason, creating a growing sense of unease among those who knew him. When his disappearance was formally reported, investigators began by retracing his last known movements, confirming that he had left campus on foot and was seen briefly near a nearby road, but beyond that point, there were no confirmed sightings, no transport records, and no clear indication of where he may have gone next. The area surrounding the campus included both urban and semi-isolated zones, which complicated the search because it introduced multiple possibilities, ranging from voluntary movement to unintended encounters, each of which required different investigative approaches but offered no immediate evidence. What made the case particularly unsettling was the absence of any triggering event, no signs of conflict, no known threats. and no behavior that suggested distress, which removed the usual starting points that investigators rely on to build a timeline or establish motive. As the search expanded, authorities considered a range of scenarios, including the possibility that he may have accepted a ride from someone, wandered into an unfamiliar area, or encountered individuals who were never identified, but without witnesses or physical evidence. These possibilities remained speculative. Days turned into weeks, and the lack of progress began to shift the case from an active search into a broader investigation, where the focus moved toward understanding how someone could disappear so completely from an area that was not entirely isolated. What stands out in this case is not a single suspicious detail, but the complete absence of them, because nothing in the available information clearly points toward an accident, a crime, or a deliberate decision to disappear, leaving behind a gap that cannot be logically filled. And as this case begins to settle into uncertainty, it introduces a pattern that will continue to appear, where the most disturbing aspect is not what is found, but what is never discovered at all. If you find yourself drawn to cases like this, where the absence of answers becomes the central element of the story and each detail matters, more for what it doesn't explain than for what it reveals, consider subscribing to the channel. Because these investigations continue to explore exactly that space between evidence and uncertainty. In 1998, in a rural region of Kenya, a small village became the center of an investigation that would remain unresolved for decades, after a local schoolteacher named Daniel Otieno failed to return home one evening, despite following a routine that had remained unchanged for years and was well known to those around him. He had finished his classes, spoken briefly with colleagues, and begun the familiar walk back to his home, a route that passed through open land and scattered paths used daily by residents, making it unlikely, at least at first glance, that anything unusual could occur without being noticed. When he did not arrive, concern began to grow, not immediately, but gradually, as family members and neighbors retraced his expected path and found no indication that he had deviated from it. And more importantly, no sign that anything had happened along the way. There were no personal belongings left behind, no disturbed ground, and no witnesses who could confirm seeing him after a certain point, which created a situation where the timeline simply ended without transition, as if the sequence of events had been interrupted without leaving a trace. Local authorities initiated a search that extended beyond the immediate area, considering the possibility that he may have taken an alternate route or encountered difficulties that forced him away from his path. But as time passed, these possibilities became increasingly unlikely due to the complete absence of supporting evidence. What made this case particularly difficult to interpret was the setting itself, because unlike urban environments where surveillance or documentation might provide clues, this was a place where movement was largely unrecorded, and where the absence of information did not necessarily indicate anything unusual until it was too late. Some theories suggested that he may have encountered individuals outside the community, possibly passing through the area, while others considered the possibility of an accident in terrain that had not been thoroughly searched. Yet, without physical confirmation, these ideas remained unresolved. Over time, the case became part of local memory rather than an active investigation, not because it lacked importance, but because it lacked direction. As every attempt to build a narrative returned to the same point, a last known moment followed by complete uncertainty. What remains particularly unsettling is how ordinary everything appeared up to that moment, because there were no warning signs, no changes in behavior, and no external factors that clearly indicated risk, which reinforces the idea that in some cases, disappearance does not announce itself, it simply occurs. And as this story settles into the same pattern of absence seen before, it becomes increasingly clear that the most disturbing element is not the event itself, but how easily it resists explanation, leaving behind a silence that cannot be broken by investigation alone. In 2011, in a coastal region of Tanzania, a case emerged that initially appeared to involve a simple logistical delay. When a small transport operator named Hassan Mwinyi failed to arrive at a scheduled delivery point after departing from a nearby town earlier that same day, following a route he had completed dozens of times without incident. He was known locally for his reliability, someone who maintained consistent schedules and rarely deviated from his routes, which made the first missed check-in unusual, but not immediately alarming, as delays could occur due to road conditions, weather, or minor mechanical issues. However, as time passed and no contact was made, concern began to grow, especially when attempts to reach him by phone failed entirely, creating a situation where the delay could no longer be explained by routine disruptions, but instead suggested something more serious had occurred along the way. When authorities began investigating, they were able to confirm his departure and identify the general route he was expected to follow. But beyond that, the trail became unclear, as there were no confirmed sightings, no reports of accidents, and no indication that his vehicle had reached any intermediate points. Search efforts focused on the most probable sections of the route, including areas where visibility was limited or where vehicles could potentially leave the road without immediate detection. Yet, even with extended efforts, no physical trace of either Hassan or his vehicle was discovered. This absence created a significant challenge, because in cases involving vehicles, there is usually some form of residual evidence, tire marks, debris, or witness accounts, but here, none of those elements were present, leaving investigators without a foundation to build upon. Several possibilities were considered, including the chance of encountering individuals along isolated stretches of road, mechanical failure followed by an attempt to seek assistance, or even a deliberate act that removed both the individual and the vehicle from the expected path. Yet each scenario lacked the evidence required to move forward. What makes this case particularly unsettling is the scale of what is missing, not just a person, but an entire vehicle, which should, in theory, be easier to locate or track, yet in this instance, both disappeared in a way that left no identifiable trace behind. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the environment itself played a role, with areas of dense vegetation, limited infrastructure, and minimal monitoring creating conditions where even large objects could remain hidden or be removed without detection. Over time, the case shifted into the same unresolved category seen in others, defined not by what was discovered, but by what could not be found, reinforcing the idea that in certain conditions, disappearance can extend beyond individuals to include everything associated with them. And as this pattern continues to emerge, it raises a deeper question, not just about what happened in each case, but about how many similar events may have occurred without ever being documented at all. In 2002, in a remote area near the border between Namibia and Angola, a case emerged that did not begin with a disappearance, but with a discovery. When a group of travelers came across a campsite that appeared to have been recently used, yet was completely abandoned under circumstances that did not make immediate sense. The site contained personal belongings, partially used supplies, and signs that someone had been there long enough to establish a temporary routine, which suggested that the departure had not been planned in advance, at least not in a way that involved packing or preparing to leave. Local authorities were alerted, and an investigation began to identify who had occupied the site, eventually linking it to a man named Elias Ndlovu, who had been traveling through the region alone, documenting his journey and maintaining occasional contact with people outside the area. His last known communication placed him near that exact location with no indication of distress or urgency, which made the condition of the campsite even more difficult to interpret, because everything suggested continuity up to a certain point, followed by a sudden and unexplained interruption. What made the situation particularly unusual was the state of the environment around the campsite, because there were no visible signs of struggle, no tracks leading clearly away from the area, and no indication that he had moved in any specific direction, as if the sequence of movement had simply ended without transition. Search teams expanded their efforts into the surrounding terrain, considering the possibility that he may have wandered away due to disorientation, encountered an accident, or attempted to follow a route that led beyond the immediate area. Yet once again, the absence of traceable evidence limited the scope of the investigation. Some theories suggested that environmental factors may have played a role, including the possibility of natural hazards that could obscure evidence over time, while others considered less predictable scenarios involving unknown encounters. But none could be substantiated in a way that allowed the case to move forward. What distinguishes this case from others is the presence of a clear starting point, a defined location where the individual was known to be, contrasted with the complete absence of any continuation beyond that point, which creates a gap that cannot be bridged through conventional methods. Aschimi past the camps itself became the only remaining reference, a fixed moment preserved in place, while everything that followed remained inaccessible, reinforcing the idea that disappearance is not always about distance, but about the sudden loss of continuity. And as this case settles into the same pattern seen across different regions and circumstances, it becomes increasingly clear that the most disturbing element is not just the lack of answers, but the way in which the sequence of events can simply stop, leaving behind no path to follow. As these cases begin to align, not through shared details, but through shared absence, a pattern emerges that is difficult to ignore because each story follows a different path, unfolds in a different environment, and involves different circumstances, yet all of them arrive at the same point: a complete and irreversible lack of explanation. There is no single theory that connects them, no unified cause that can account for how these events unfold. And yet the similarities exist in the structure itself, in the way each case begins with something ordinary, something stable, something that gives no indication of what is about to happen. In every instance, there is a moment where continuity breaks, where movement, communication, and traceability all stop at once or fade into nothing, leaving behind only a last known point that cannot be extended into a full sequence of events. What makes this particularly unsettling is not just the disappearance of individuals, but the disappearance of information, because in each case, the evidence that should exist either never appears or cannot be recovered, creating a situation where even the most basic reconstruction becomes impossible. The systems designed to prevent this: communication networks, known routes, predictable routines, all function up to a certain point. But beyond that threshold, they reveal their limitations, especially in environments where unpredictability is not the exception, but part of the structure itself. And as these limitations become visible, the question shifts from what happened in each individual case to something broader, something more difficult to answer, which is, how many similar events occur without ever being recorded, without investigation, and without recognition? Because not every disappearance becomes a case, not every absence is documented, and not every unanswered question is pursued, which means that what we see here may only represent a fraction of what actually exists. And perhaps the most disturbing possibility is not that these cases remain unsolved, but that they may be unsolvable, not due to a lack of effort, but because the information required to solve them no longer exists within reach. So as these stories come to an end, what remains is not a conclusion, but a question that does not resolve itself. Because if a person can vanish without a trace, without witnesses, without evidence, and without explanation, then the real uncertainty is not just about where they went, but whether the truth behind their disappearance was ever something that could be fully known at all.